Well, again, thank you all for being here, and we're going to be in Romans chapter 4 tonight. So just to try and keep track of where we are in Paul's discussion, Paul is talking about kind of the need for Christ in the world because of the universal nature of sin. So we talked a lot in chapter 1 about the larger Gentile world and the way that it's gotten some revelation from God, but has largely rejected God despite having some awareness. And so because of that reason, the Gentile world deserves God's condemnation. But then Paul says Israel is behaving very similarly to the Gentiles, even though they've had the law revealed to them. And so he goes on in 3 to say that both groups are equally in need of salvation, that fallenness from sin is kind of a universal human condition that Jews and Gentiles experience. The law helps Israel recognize sin, but it doesn't provide them a means of justification. That's another good thing to just stop and clarify tonight, that we're going to use the words righteousness and justification a lot. And sometimes those can be words that we hear a lot in church context, but don't always immediately know what they mean. So righteousness means, in the context of Romans, being in right relationship to God. Righteousness is something God has, and so for a human to be righteous means to be in the right relationship with God. And justification means becoming righteous. It's kind of an unfortunate quirk of the language we're all speaking here today, that in Greek, righteousness and justification are just the same word in slightly different forms. It's one word. I wish I could think of a good way to say that in English, but they're not two separate words like they are in English. God is righteous and he makes people righteous. And we call that process of making people righteous justifying or justification. But in your head, kind of just keep that in mind in the back of your head, that righteousness and justification are the same word for Paul. Righteousness is something God has, and it's something that he gives to people. And so the problem we talked about in the last chapter was that the law points out unrighteousness, but it doesn't grant righteousness to people. It only shows the problem. It doesn't give a solution to it. Christ is the means by which people become back in right relationship with God, not the law. And so Paul is now going to do this kind of clever thing I really like in this section of Romans, where he is going to take what might be the first objection to what he's saying and turn it into the strongest point he can possibly make for it. And he's going to talk in this chapter about Abraham. Now, Abraham, of course, the Jewish people consider Abraham to be really the start of the Jewish people, that he's the one that they're all ultimately descended from. And Paul is going to ask some questions about Abraham. So I want to start off and read, and this is going to be a little bit of a dense chapter. We'll stop and unpack it, and I think it'll be clear. But we're going to talk about Abraham, who's the father of all of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people being the ones with the law and the one that salvation comes to the world through. But the question that Paul's going to ask here in this first section is, what justified Abraham? How did Abraham get to be in right relationship to God? So I want to start. We're going to read the first 8 verses. What shall we say we gained by Abraham? We switched translations. I got a few Bibles in front of me. This is in chapter 4. What then are we to say was gained by Abraham, our ancestor according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Quote, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now to the one who works, wages are not reckoned as a gift, but something that is due. But to one who without works trusts him who justifies the ungodly, such faith is reckoned as righteousness. So also David speaks of the blessedness of those to whom God reckons righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one against whom the Lord will not reckon sin. So, what about Abraham is the question here? Because the thing that Paul's sort of floating around is, what is God's relationship to Israel? Was that like a failed way that God wanted to bring salvation to the world, but it didn't work? And Paul answers no to that by going back to Abraham. And he asks the question, how was Abraham justified? And think about it. Abraham, we don't know a lot about his background before he gets God's call in Genesis 13, or 12, Genesis 12. But we know pretty certainly that he would have been a pagan from a pagan background then. He lived in Chaldea is the old kind of the Hebrew Bible word for it. But he lived in, closer to what would be called Babylon a little bit later in the Bible's time period. He probably worshipped Babylonian gods. He certainly didn't worship Yahweh, the God of Israel, because Yahweh hadn't revealed himself like that yet. Abraham is really the first to get that call. We get this long sort of primeval history in Genesis 11, but it ends with this sort of idea that humanity is basically cut off from God after Babel, at least in terms of kind of the direct communication. But then God makes the call to Abraham that results in the people of Israel coming. But Abraham is a pagan. Now, some people in Paul's day, some Jewish interpreters, also wrestled with this question of why did God choose Abraham, or what was Abraham's background before he met God? And some Jewish interpreters assumed that Abraham must have followed the Torah even before the Torah was given to him, that he somehow had the sort of special knowledge of it, and that Abraham was righteous, and that's why God chose him, that Abraham was already following the Torah, even though it hadn't been given. And Paul says, no, we know this pretty well. There are a couple of references to Abraham's family idols in Genesis, that Abraham wasn't following Torah when God called him. And in fact, even the most basic parts of the law, like the commandment to circumcision, are given actually a pretty good deal after God first calls Abraham and works with him. So Paul says the founder of our faith, the person that we all trace our spiritual and ethnic heritage to, was a pagan who was justified, and he has the receipts for it. He says in Genesis 15, it says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So Abraham is called righteous, in other words, being sin forgiven and right relationship with God before the law ever came into the world. So how does that happen? The only thing that Abraham had done at this point in the story, Paul says, is believe God. Abraham believes, and it's called righteousness, even when the law is not actually even physically available. It's never been given. So in this way, Paul is going to make this sort of, scandalous, even I think, in his context, potentially offensive, but I think hard to disagree with argument that Abraham, the founder of, not founder, it's not quite right to say, but Abraham, the progenitor of the Jewish people, was himself kind of a Gentile convert, right? He wasn't born into Israel. Israel comes from him. So we can't say that the law is the primary way that people are justified, because Israel's father was justified by faith. He didn't do good works. God told Abraham, go leave the land of your family and go to a land I'll show you. And Abraham believed God. And that corrected his relationship. That brought him justification. And he uses this analogy here. He says, now when someone's worked for something, when you pay them, that's not giving them a gift, right? If I work for you, you owe me until you pay me. I gave you something, you have to give me something back. But that's not, he says, what's happening with Abraham. He didn't do work. He didn't, follow the law or do good spiritual deeds. God gave Abraham justification. God gave Abraham forgiveness and a right relationship with God for free in response to Abraham's faith, not anything he did. And so kind of goes on to ask, continue on with this question of sort of, well, what was the point of this? Like, what was the point of Israel? And he goes on to talk now about circumcision. And again, it's maybe always a little bit weird for us today, hearing as much in the New Testament as there is about circumcision, but this was really, in the context of Genesis, kind of the first act of what would be the law, the Torah, that Israel had. Before any other real commandments were given to Abraham, before the law was given to Moses at Sinai, the very first thing they get is a like sign of their covenant with God is circumcision. That God tells Abraham after he makes the covenant, circumcise yourself and have your children circumcised, and that's going to be the sign of our covenant. Because remember, God calls Abraham in Genesis 12, but in Genesis 15 is when he makes the covenant with Abraham and gives him circumcision. So he is justified. He's called Abraham righteous before that ever came either. But he goes on to talk about it. So to read in 9 through 12 now. Is this blessedness then pronounced only on the circumcised or also on the uncircumcised? We say, faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it reckoned to him? Was it before or after he was circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the ancestor of all who believe without being circumcised, and who thus have righteousness reckoned to them. And likewise, the ancestor of the circumcised, who are not only circumcised, but also follow the example of the faith that our ancestor Abraham had before he was circumcised. So circumcision, Paul says, is like, it's a sign. He calls it the sign of circumcision. A good analogy here, I think, is like a wedding ring for us today. A couple of weeks ago, we missed Bible study on a Sunday night because I was in Houston officiating the wedding of a good friend. And it was a great experience. And of course, towards the end of the ceremony, we had an exchange of rings, right? Where I had them repeat a vow. I had the groom repeat a vow and then put the ring on the bride's hand. And then I had the bride repeat a vow and put the ring on the groom's hand. And then after that, I said some words, and then they were married. And the ring was kind of the sign of that. Now, the ring didn't make them married, right? And the ring was also not the start of their relationship. Like, they didn't have a relationship because they got each other rings. The rings were the sign of the thing they'd already been doing. And even similarly, the rings don't make them married. You guys have probably noticed this really bad habit I have of I fidget with my wedding ring and lose it all the time. I'm always afraid people are going to think that I just have the rockiest marriage ever because I am wearing my wedding ring like 40% of the time. But the ring isn't the marriage. I'm still married even when I'm being silly and dropping my ring somewhere. If you're wondering, we have to buy these like a kind of cheap rubber rings just because I'm so bad about fidgeting and losing them. But all that to go to the point, the sign is important, but the sign isn't the thing that it's symbolizing. Circumcision is the sign of the covenant God made with Abraham, but it wasn't the act that justified Abraham. It's the other way around. Abraham received circumcision as this commandment because he'd been justified. Paul said, God declares Abraham righteous, and then because he's declared him righteous, he tells him to be circumcised. And so he says Abraham is the forefather not only of those of us with circumcision, the ethnic Jews, but also those who have faith without circumcision. He's continuing this kind of metaphor that not only is Abraham the progenitor of the Jewish people, he's also the progenitor of the Gentile Christians now, the people that have faith without having that covenant with God in the Old Testament. So circumcision, he says, is the important sign that God gave to Abraham, but it was a sign of something that had already happened, justification. So we're still building up this point that God declared Abraham right before him when Abraham hadn't really done anything except trusted God. So he goes on in 13. I'll read here through 13 through 50, a little bit smaller here. For the promise that he would inherit the world did not come to Abraham or to his descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. If it is the adherents of the law who are to be his heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation. So again, think back to the Abraham story. Abraham is pagan of some sort, living in Chaldea near Babylon today, and he hears God call him and say, just leave your home and start walking, and I'll tell you as you're walking where to go. Go back and reread Abraham's story in Genesis if you haven't lately. It's really remarkable how that's sort of stark. Like, God doesn't make Abraham a specific offer. He just tells him, get up and go, and I'll tell you where you're going eventually. And where he starts off is a pretty long way away from Israel today. He's going from, I think it's in Iraq today, where that would be, to Israel kind of proper today. But Abraham does it. And then Abraham, sort of the promises come. Abraham doesn't have any descendants. He and his wife are not capable of having children, but God tells him, just keep following me, and I'm going to make you the father of an entire nation. And through that nation, he's going to say, and I think it's the end of 13, through your nation, the entire world will be blessed. It's this big, remarkable promise that Israel always understands itself after God makes it. That God not only gave Abraham descendants and a nation coming out of him, but that his nation was going to be a unique blessing to the world. This month, I've been writing for another Bible study curriculum project on the prophets, on Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And they're always kind of directly or indirectly reminding the people of this, that Israel is supposed to be a blessing to the world, and we're not fulfilling that obligation right now, and that's why there's going to be trouble for us. But he says again, Paul's saying, when God made the promise to Abraham that defined Israel, when God promised that you were going to be a nation that's going to change the world, that was before Abraham had any of the law, before even the covenant with God. That was still when the only thing Abraham had done wasn't any good works. It was just believing in God. It was just trusting God about what God said. And that made Abraham righteous enough for God to make this promise to him. And so he goes on in 16 through 22. And he says, for this reason, it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his descendants, not only to the adherents of the law, but also to those who share the faith of Abraham. For he is the father of us all, as it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. So again, remember, Paul is saying that Abraham is not only the descendant of ethnic Israel, but he's also the spiritual father of all those who have faith in God, that he's the spiritual father of the Gentiles in the same way he's the ethnic father of the Jewish people. In the presence of God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Hoping against hope, he, Abraham, believed that he would become the father of many nations, according to what was said, so numerous shall your descendants be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promises of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. Therefore, his faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. So he goes through and sort of closes with this meditation on Abraham and Abraham's faith. Now, again, I say it's always good to go back and read Abraham's story in Genesis. It's so important to the entire Bible. And you will see that Abraham's faith is not necessarily as steadfast and unquestionable as Paul makes it out to be here. But for the purposes here that he's talking about, Abraham showed faith. Even when he stumbled, Abraham still had faith in God. And in a lot of ways, I think Paul is sort of comparing Abraham, this first person to have faith in God, as he's setting up the analogy, with sort of the state of the world under sin. Think about what Paul said about the world in chapter 1. He says that God has been calling out to people, but the people are choosing to ignore God. But Abraham, who has faith, we see now in chapter 4, didn't. When God called Abraham, Abraham listened. And similarly in chapter 1, the people don't believe that God is powerful, that God is really able to do the things God says he'll do. But Abraham does. Abraham doesn't balk. As Paul's telling it here, it's a little more complicated, but he doesn't balk when he hears God say that he's going to be a father of many nations, even though he's 100 years old with no kids. Abraham trusts God's power. People in Genesis, not in Romans 1, Paul talks about how people worship things they made. They prefer idols to God. But Abraham, when he's called by God, puts his idols away and puts his faith in the God who made the world. Faith kind of makes Abraham into a new type of person. A theme we're going to get to in the next chapter is the way that through Christ, kind of a new world is born, a new people is born, that previously humanity is under sin. Humanity is fallen and estranged from God. But because of Jesus's work, humans have a new way they can be. There's a new type of humanity that we can become a part of. And Abraham, Paul says here, is the first sort of taste of this. He's the anticipation of it. There's a reason Jesus comes out of Abraham's line, because Abraham, though he wasn't sinless, though he wasn't God, though he couldn't have done redemption like Jesus can, Abraham had faith, and that justified him before God. God chose to call their relationship right and proper and not indebted anymore because of Abraham's faith. Again, the elephant in the room here is not because of works, not because he followed the law really well, not because he did enough good things, only because he had faith in God. That's the whole reason that he was justified by God. And so Paul ends here with sort of a transition into next week's chapter, which I really love, chapter 5. But he says here, "Now the words, 'it was reckoned to him,' were written not for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be reckoned to us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, who was handed over to death for our trespasses and was raised for our justification." Remember, justification means being made righteous, and righteous means being in the right relationship with God. Again, it's kind of a little bit of an issue here with how the verses, how the chapters are brought up. But this is the transition for Paul, that he keeps talking about all these things that God did for Abraham because of Abraham's faith. And then he says, and because of Jesus, what happened with Abraham can happen with all of us. We all have the potential to experience that same thing Abraham experienced through faith because of Jesus. And exactly how that happens, we're going to get into next week, in just a really fantastic chapter I'm really looking forward to. But for now, that is Romans 4 and Paul's example of Abraham. We'll come back to it again a little bit later in the book. But